Princess Anne has just stunned the entire United Kingdom by breaking the one silence she had guarded more fiercely than any palace oath, placing before King Charles a dossier that allegedly traced hidden financial dealings connected to Queen Camilla. And the reaction inside the crown was so abrupt, so devastating, that even the palace machinery appeared to lose its aristocratic composure. For decades, Anne had been the institution's silent protector, the loyalist who endured every fracture without complaint, the woman who stood at the edge of history and carried its most poisonous secrets alone. But a catastrophic discovery, one that reportedly forced her hand, has now made silence impossible. What exactly did Anne find inside those sealed records? Why did Charles explicitly order the palace communications room to sever every external feed? And what dark hidden arrangement finally compelled the Princess Royal to confront the king himself? The answers began unfolding before dawn, inside the cavernous, hauntingly quiet library of Gatcombe Park, where frost clung to the windows and the first pale light of morning turned the ancient trees into black, skeletal witnesses. Rain had fallen through the night, needling the gravel drives and gathering in silver beads along the mullioned glass. Beyond the walls, the estate slept beneath a low, suffocating sky. Inside, however, a green-shaded lamp burned above a mahogany desk, illuminating a cream-colored envelope that looked too ordinary to contain the machinery of a constitutional crisis. Its paper was thick, faintly ridged, and darkened at the corners, as though it had spent years inside a locked drawer. A crimson wax seal bore a small swallow, its wings lifted in flight. The impression was imperfect. One edge had cracked. Anne's gloved thumb hovered above it, not touching, not yet. Beside the envelope lay a silver cipher key, a narrow forensic report, and 3 photocopied account ledgers whose figures had been blacked out in places by someone determined to conceal not only sums, but ownership. The scent of aged paper mingled with beeswax, damp wool, and the faint metallic tang of the old brass fireplace screen. Somewhere in the corridor, a clock ticked with maddening precision. Anne stood beneath a portrait of a long-dead earl, straight-backed, pale, and entirely still. Then she lifted her eyes toward the camera. The broadcast had not been announced. It had not been approved. It existed because a loyal aide had quietly routed a secondary signal through a private uplink before the palace could close the apparatus. Anne's voice, when it came, was growly, weighted, and trembling beneath the surface. "For 26 years, she declared, her fingers tightening around the envelope, the world has spoken for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Today, I am speaking for the crown's duty, and for the truth it has been ordered to bury," she rasped, the final word catching in her throat. Across the room, her archivist, Miss Eleanor Vane, shifted uneasily. Sweat shone along the woman's hairline despite the cold. Her hands trembled over a compact communications console, where encrypted feeds pulsed in green and amber. A satellite uplink blinked twice, then vanished. "They've found the route," Eleanor whispered, her breath hitched, eyes fixed on the screen. "The palace communications office is attempting to cut the signal." Anne did not turn. "Then let them try," she choked out, her voice low and iron-hard. "They have had decades." The envelope seemed to grow heavier as the room filled with the invisible pressure of watching millions. Somewhere in London, servers were holding. Across Britain, screens flickered simultaneously. In Edinburgh, according to the first unverified reports, pint glasses froze halfway to lips as the Princess Royal appeared without warning. The nation held its breath. The first account ledger had been discovered in November 2025, after an estate inventory required the cataloguing of documents removed from an old private office at St. James's Palace. The discovery itself was not dramatic. No locked vault exploded open. No hooded conspirator fled through a corridor. It was a tired archivist, working beneath fluorescent lights, who noticed that a brass drawer in a disused filing cabinet sat 2 millimeters higher than the others. When the drawer was pulled, it resisted. When it finally opened, the sound was a dry mechanical click, followed by the smell of dust and cedar. Behind a false panel lay a packet of bank correspondence, foundation memoranda, and transfer instructions bearing dates that appeared to overlap with periods of intense private expenditure around the royal household. The documents did not prove a crime. They did, however, raise questions that no palace statement had answered. The names were layered behind holding companies, charitable trusts, and management entities registered in jurisdictions known for strict financial privacy. One label appeared repeatedly: the Blue Swallow Settlement. Another referred to an account code ending in 1997. A third bore the phrase North Star Reserve, written in a hand that seemed deliberately disguised. Anne had seen the first copies in a side room at Gatcombe, beneath the rhythmic click of an Oxford shoe approaching and retreating beyond the door. It was then that an old memory returned, not as a story, but as a sensation. Summer, 1981. The scent of white gardanas drifted through a corridor at Balmoral, mingling with peat smoke and rain. Anne had been young enough to believe that royal walls protected everyone inside them. Diana, newly married and visibly overwhelmed, stood near a grandfather clock while a swallow-shaped brooch glimmered at her throat. She had spoken softly, almost playfully, but her eyes had remained fixed on the dark window. "Some things are hidden because they are private," Diana whispered, her voice trembling beneath a careful smile. "Other things are hidden because someone is afraid of what they become when light touches them." The clock chimed. Diana's hand closed around the brooch. If you ever find a paper marked with a swallow, Anne, don't ask who wants you to keep it. Ask who would be ruined if you opened it. Anne remembered the words now with agonizing clarity. In the library, the clock struck 6. Miss Vane flinched as another encrypted feed appeared. The King's office is demanding authentication, she hissed, her face drained of color. They're saying this transmission is unauthorized and potentially destabilizing. Potentially destabilizing, Anne repeated, and for the first time something like contempt crossed her expression. That is what they call a question when the answer threatens the furniture. The second packet contained no dramatic confession. Instead, it held a sequence of instructions, distributions to private investment managers, the transfer of art valuation rights, and references to unrecorded assets whose legal ownership appeared to change whenever scrutiny approached. The figures were large, but their meaning was uncertain. Some belonged to inherited estates, some might have been legitimate trusts, some could have been bookkeeping errors, yet the pattern, Anne believed, was calculated. Every path seemed to lead toward a structure designed to keep certain wealth invisible even to members of the family who had been expected to defend it, and in the margin of one ledger, written in blue-black ink, appeared a sentence that turned the entire discovery from a financial puzzle into a personal betrayal. The Princess Royal must never be shown the reserve. The words were underlined once, not twice, once. That was the mark of someone confident that a command would be obeyed. It was not. The trap had been set years before Anne knew she was standing inside it. The men in gray had no official title that appeared in any directory, and that was precisely what made them dangerous. They were not royal by blood. They did not stand on balconies or wear crowns. They moved through the machinery of the palace as invisible architects, carrying clipboards, sealed folders, and the cold confidence of men who understood that institutions rarely collapsed because of one lie. They collapsed because thousands of obedient people agreed not to examine the same lie twice. The figure Anne remembered most clearly was a senior court operative known inside the household only as the custodian. He was always dressed in a charcoal suit, always polished from collar to Oxford shoe, always holding a clipboard in one pale hand. His cold eyes never seemed to focus on the person in front of him. They focused on consequences. He had been present at briefings after Diana's isolation, during the years when family correspondence was filtered, and during the quiet construction of rival narratives that widened the fracture between William and Harry. He had never ordered a tragedy in words that could be recorded. He merely designed the corridors through which tragedy became unavoidable. Now his shadow appeared beside the Blue Swallow settlement. A signature on a trust memorandum matched the angular flourish found on internal palace notices from 1995, 2002, and 2017. The name attached to the signature was not a royal name. It belonged to a private administrative office, a role that officially handled heritage planning, but unofficially touched security, communications, and the movement of sensitive papers. Anne had not discovered a single villain. She had discovered an architecture. The question is not whether every transfer was unlawful, she said, staring into the lens, because that is for investigators and courts to determine. The question is why the accounts were hidden from the very people who were expected to defend the Crown's finances, and why a warning written decades ago identifies the same mechanism now sitting before us. She placed the first ledger on the desk. The paper made a soft, terrible sound. In a private memorandum dated September 1995, a reference appeared to the consort's discretionary reserve, though no corresponding public record could be located. The memorandum described assets as protected from household volatility. A second page used a more chilling phrase. If the Princess Royal inquires, redirect through Heritage Council. Anne's jaw tightened. She had been redirected before. She had been given summaries instead of documents, assurances instead of signatures, and carefully polished explanations that dissolved whenever a question became specific. A memory came to her from autumn 1992, when the palace corridors smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, and every telephone seemed to ring with the nervous rhythm of approaching disaster. Diana had appeared outside a small sitting room, her face pale beneath a brimmed hat. She carried no handbag, only a folded sheet of cream paper. The rhythmic click of Oxford shoes sounded from the staircase. They are counting on everyone being too dignified to ask where the money went, Diana whispered, her eyes darting toward the corridor. Dignity can be a virtue, but in the wrong hands it becomes a curtain. She pressed the folded sheet into Anne's palm, then withdrew it before Anne could open it. Not yet. If you open it too soon, they will say you misunderstood. If you open it when they think you are already defeated, they will have nowhere to hide. The memory fractured as the library lights dimmed. Miss Vane's console emitted a shrill tone. On the central monitor, a warning appeared. Signal integrity compromised. They're routing a counter-statement, the archivist whispered. The palace says the material is fabricated, the broadcast is malicious, and the Princess Royal has been deceived. Anne's expression did not change, but the knuckles of her right hand turned white. Of course they do. She opened the cream-colored envelope. The crimson wax resisted, then cracked with a sharp report that sounded like a pistol in the silent room. 20 million people were watching live by the time the seal broke. The first sheet inside was not a letter, but a handwritten inventory. It listed accounts held outside the ordinary constitutional reporting cycle, followed by codes, dates, and initials. Next to one account, a note read, "Assets associated with the consort's family office. Access requires dual authorization." Next to another, "Art, land, and securities transferred under protective structures." Nothing in the list alone established wrongdoing. Yet the pattern suggested a system of concealment so elaborate that it might have been created not to evade law, but to evade accountability. Anne turned the pages with deliberate care. "This is not an accusation made for spectacle," she declared, her voice roughening. "It is evidence of a question that was repeatedly refused." The camera tightened on a column of figures. Several sums corresponded with purchases publicly attributed to unrelated trusts. A property in the west of England appeared under a development company that had no visible connection to the royal household. Yet an internal note referred to the king's private comfort. Another entry listed an offshore custodian and described its beneficial interest as not for circulation. The phrase appeared 3 times. The palace machinery began to panic. A red light blinked on the console. A secure line opened without being invited. Then the antique telephone on the side table rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Eleanor froze. Anne reached for the receiver. "Princess Royal," a male voice rasped, stripped of sovereign authority. "You must stop this." It was Charles. His words arrived in broken fragments, each one surrounded by static. "You don't understand what that file will do. Anne, please, listen to me." "I have listened for 40 years, she choked out, her eyes fixed on the lens. "Now you will listen to the document." "It is not what you think," he whispered, his breath audibly shaking. "Then tell Britain what it is." There was a long silence. Somewhere on the line, machinery clicked. "Who gave you the swallow?" Charles finally asked, and the question altered the atmosphere more completely than any denial could have done. Anne closed her eyes. The swallow had not been mentioned in the public briefing. It had not appeared on the ledger cover. Only someone who had seen the hidden packet would know. Charles disconnected. The line went dead. He was terrified. Outside Gatcombe, dawn broke over the frost-covered fields, but the light did not soften the estate. It exposed every branch, every stone, every darkened window. Inside the palace, aides moved from room to room carrying instructions that contradicted one another. One order demanded silence. Another demanded an immediate denial. A third instructed security to locate the original documents before they reached independent investigators. The contradictions revealed the panic more clearly than any statement. Anne lifted the second ledger and found a note dated the 14th of February 1997. It referred to the final transfer before the Paris contingency. She paused. The word contingency had been used in other records connected to Diana's protection arrangements, her movements, and the strange administrative decisions made during the months before her death. Anne had no basis to claim the financial records caused anything. She knew that. But she also knew how systems hid their own history. By placing ordinary words beside extraordinary consequences until no one could say where management ended and calculation began. The third packet contained a transcript from a meeting held in a secure room at Clarence House on the 3rd of March 1997. The transcript was incomplete, its margins marked with red numbers, but one exchange remained legible. An unnamed senior operative had warned that the consort's financial exposure must be contained before the family narrative becomes unmanageable. Another voice had replied that the Princess Royal was too disciplined to be distracted by sentiment. The first voice answered, "Discipline is precisely why she must never see the entire chain." Anne read the line twice. Her face remained composed, but beneath the desk her left hand closed around the edge of the chair until the wood pressed into her palm. The men in gray had misunderstood her discipline. They had mistaken silence for obedience. They had mistaken duty for surrender. The custodian had operated through committees and private offices, through polite memoranda and appointments that appeared administrative but carried consequences no one dared challenge. He did not need to command Charles. He only needed to present one option as loyal and the other as catastrophic. He did not need to order Camilla's accounts hidden. He needed only to construct a language in which hidden accounts sounded like protection, private wealth sounded like continuity, and scrutiny sounded like betrayal. Anne looked down at the swallow's seal. A second flashback rose from the smell of wax. Winter, 1987. A ballroom at Sandringham had been cleared after a charity dinner, leaving only half-burned candles and the thin echo of distant conversation. Diana stood at a window, watching sleet strike the glass. The swallow brooch rested on the table between them. "There is a man who never raises his voice," Diana murmured, the words almost lost beneath the grandfather clock. "He has cold eyes and polished shoes, and he carries papers that make people believe he is only doing his job." Anne had glanced toward the doorway. "You sound frightened." "I am not frightened of him," Diana whispered, her fingers brushing the brooch. "I am frightened of how many people become him when they decide their comfort is more important than the truth." The memory ended with the click of Oxford shoes somewhere beyond the ballroom. In the library, Eleanor Vane was crying silently. "There's a biometric reference in the margin," she whispered, wiping her cheek with a shaking hand. The original was scanned by an independent laboratory. The ink, pressure pattern, and paper fibers matched the archive sample. Then the handwriting is authentic, Anne said. The handwriting is authentic, Eleanor corrected, her voice trembling. The interpretation remains disputed. Anne nodded. That is why we show both. She placed the forensic report beneath the camera. The report did not declare that the accounts were illegal. It confirmed that several pages had been physically handled by the same individual whose biometric signature was present on restricted palace documents from 1995 and 1997. It confirmed that the crimson wax contained a resin blend historically used by a private royal office. It confirmed that the cipher markings were consistent with an old household encryption system. Most importantly, it confirmed that the packet had not been assembled recently from unrelated material. The documents belonged together. The palace issued another statement. It described the broadcast as a regrettable exploitation of family tension and insisted that all financial arrangements associated with Queen Camilla had been reviewed through appropriate channels. The phrase appropriate channels sounded harmless until Anne turned to a page listing the channels themselves. Many led back to the same administrative office, the same men, the same charcoal suits, the same invisible architecture. She didn't just predict the existence of this file, Anne said, her voice lowering. She named the exact person who would try to suppress it. The room seemed to contract. Eleanor's breath caught. You're certain? I am certain of what the document says, Anne replied, her gaze unwavering. What the courts decide is separate, but the prophecy is precise. In the bottom corner of Diana's letter, beneath the swallow crest, appeared a date. The 6th of August 2026, yesterday. The exact day before the unauthorized broadcast. The coincidence was mathematical, almost obscene in its precision. Diana had written the date decades earlier, long before the accounts were catalogued, long before the palace communications room attempted to cut the signal. The letter had not predicted a vague crisis. It had identified the moment when the concealed mechanism would be exposed. The men in gray could dismiss an emotional memory. They could attack a financial interpretation. They could not easily explain a date written 30 years before it arrived. A second phone interrupted the room. This time it was not the antique rotary instrument, but a silver satellite handset hidden in a drawer. It vibrated across the mahogany surface, inching toward the open ledger. Anne allowed it to ring until the third vibration. Then she answered. Anne, whispered William, his voice stripped of public confidence. I'm at Windsor. The doors have been locked. His breathing was uneven. They're saying it's a security procedure, but no one will tell me who ordered it. Have you seen the broadcast? Anne asked, her voice softening. Yes. A pause. Is it true? It is evidence. That isn't what I asked. His voice cracked, suddenly becoming the broken sob of a 15-year-old boy who had been told for years that the adults knew best. Did they hide this from us? Anne looked at the envelope. They hid it from everyone they believed would protect the institution before protecting the truth. William exhaled sharply. In the background a door slammed. Anne, there's someone here. The custodian's office. Do not sign anything, she commanded, the words cutting through the static. Do not surrender the originals, and do not let them separate you from Harry. He's on the way, William choked out. He said he was coming home. The satellite line dissolved into interference. For several seconds, only the sound of rain remained. Across the world, millions of screens held the image of Anne standing beside the swallow-marked letter. The revelation had reached the princes before the palace could shape it. The institution was no longer controlling the story. The story was controlling the institution. Anne now opened the final page. It was written in Diana's hand, the letters slanted and uneven, as though the writer had been interrupted more than once. The ink had faded to brown. Near the bottom, a small swallow had been drawn with 2 strokes of the pen. Beneath it was a warning. The money is not the secret. The secret is who decides what the family is permitted to know about itself. Anne read the sentence aloud, and the words seemed to travel beyond the room, beyond Gatcombe, through every encrypted channel the palace had failed to close. Then she continued. If the Princess Royal opens this after the date marked, she must understand that the reserve was never only a reserve. It was a lever. Whoever holds it can make a king believe that disclosure would destroy the crown, when in truth concealment is what destroys it. Eleanor covered her mouth. The camera remained steady. Anne's eyes had become glass bright, but her voice did not break. Diana had not accused Camilla by name. She had not claimed that every account was fraudulent, or that every transfer represented criminal conduct. She had described a system in which financial opacity could become political power, and she had warned that the person who controlled the records could control the family's choices. At the bottom of the page, one final line had been added. The man in gray will still be inside the palace when the swallow flies. The custodian was not named with a personal name. He was named by role. It was enough. The men in gray were cornered. The first consequence arrived before the page was fully read. Buckingham Palace went silent. Its public website lost 3 separate statements, each appearing briefly before being replaced by a gray error screen. The official household account posted a sentence, deleted it, posted another, and then stopped altogether. No comment, no clarification, no familiar reassurance from a smiling spokesman. The absence became its own announcement. In London, cameras gathered outside gates that had witnessed weddings, funerals, celebrations, and mourning. Reporters watched aides cross the forecourt with faces fixed in expressions of aristocratic composure. One aide dropped a folder. Another bent to retrieve it, and remained crouched for several seconds, as though the weight of the papers had become too great. At Gatcombe, Anne continued. "The evidence before you does not pronounce guilt," she stated, every syllable deliberate. "It establishes that information concerning certain assets, trusts and reserves was distributed through a restricted network, and that the network was overseen by people whose authority exceeded the public description of their offices." She lifted a document bearing a blue security stamp. "It also establishes that the same network attempted to prevent this material from reaching independent review." A sudden sound broke the silence, the metallic clatter of a door striking its stopper. Eleanor turned. "We have visitors." Through the rain-blurred windows, two black vehicles moved slowly along the drive. Their headlights swept over the wet stone walls. The men in gray had arrived not in disguises, but in the uniform of official calm. A charcoal suit emerged first, then polished Oxford shoes touched the gravel. The custodian carried a clipboard. His face was older than Anne remembered, but the cold eyes had not changed. The broadcast camera caught him in profile as he crossed the courtyard. Millions saw the invisible architect become visible. He did not look toward the lens. That was his first mistake. "How did you get past the gates?" Eleanor whispered, her hands trembling. "They have authority over the estate." "They have always believed they do," Anne rasped. She walked to the library door. The camera remained behind her, transmitting the corridor in a long dim frame. "My lord," she called, her tone flint beneath velvet, "you are trespassing." The custodian stopped. "Princess Royal," he replied, his voice mild and almost bored. "I am here to prevent a national misunderstanding. You are here to retrieve documents." His eyes flicked toward the desk. "Those documents are protected." "By whom?" "By the Crown." Anne opened the door wider. "Then the Crown may come and explain its protection." For the first time the custodian's composure faltered. Not visibly to an ordinary observer perhaps, but the camera captured the minute tightening around his mouth. He glanced at his clipboard, where a single page had been marked with a red diagonal line. "You have placed the monarchy in danger," he hissed, his voice losing its polished restraint. "No," Anne answered. "You have placed secrecy above the monarchy." The words landed with the force of a verdict. Somewhere in Windsor, William locked a door. Somewhere in a car moving through the night, Harry boarded a private flight. The palace machinery had expected distance to protect it. Instead, the brothers were converging on the same truth. The custodian stepped inside the threshold. "The king is under extraordinary pressure," he choked out. "He must be protected from material that could be manipulated by hostile actors." "And the queen?" Anne demanded. "Was she protected from the records, or was she protected by them?" The question traveled instantly through the broadcast. Social platforms surged, search servers strained. Analysts began reposting images of the swallow seal, the account code, and the date written in Diana's hand. In villages, in city flats, in army barracks, and in private offices overlooking the Thames, people watched the confrontation without knowing whether the signal would survive another minute. The custodian reached for the packet. Anne moved faster than anyone expected, and closed her hand over the documents. "Touch these papers," she warned, "and your attempt to suppress them becomes part of the evidence." His face drained of color. The trap had been set. The physical proof lay beneath the first false bottom compartment of the mahogany desk. Anne had discovered it after the documents were authenticated, when Eleanor noticed that the drawer mechanism had two distinct springs. The first opened the ordinary compartment. The second required the silver cipher key. When Anne inserted it, the key turned with resistance. A hidden bolt withdrew. Then came the mechanical click of a compartment opening behind the desk's rear panel. Inside rested a sealed plastic sleeve, a black cassette, and a thin forensic envelope marked with the words "Do not duplicate." The cassette had no label except a hand-drawn swallow. The forensic envelope contained a report from specialists who had compared the wax seal, the paper fibers, the ink composition, and the pressure patterns in the handwriting. It did not authenticate the financial interpretation. It authenticated the chain of custody. The packet had been hidden before the date it referenced. The date had not been added later. The recording was older still. Anne lifted the cassette. "This is the moment Diana's voice enters the record," she whispered, her breath caught between grief and resolve. Eleanor connected the player to the broadcast console. Static filled the library. Then came the sound of a room from another age, a clock, distant rain, and a woman breathing carefully before speaking. "If you are hearing this," Diana's recorded voice began, "the people who told you to wait have run out of reasons." Anne's eyes closed. The voice was not theatrical. It was quiet, intimate, and exhausted. "They will say the accounts are private. They will say the structures are lawful. They will say the family must remain united. Listen carefully. A family is not united when one person is forced to defend a truth they are forbidden to see." The cassette clicked and briefly distorted. Then Diana continued. "The reserve is a lever. The man who controls the records can make the king afraid of his own signature. He can make the consort appear protected while making the institution appear dependent. He can make brothers distrust one another by ensuring each receives a different version of the same truth. William's voice had been audible in the background of the room before the call ended, but now no one spoke. "The man in gray," Diana said, "will tell you that disclosure is betrayal. Do not believe him." Betrayal began when the truth was divided. A tremor passed through Anne's shoulders. One tear escaped, traveled down her cheek and stopped at her jaw. She did not wipe it away. The broadcast had become something more than an allegation. It was a posthumous warning, a personal testament, and a challenge to every official who had relied on the public's reverence as a substitute for evidence. The recording continued through a wash of static. "There is one more thing," Diana said. "If the date arrives and the swallow is opened, the family will be told that the danger lies in the revelation. That is the failsafe. They will close doors, remove telephones, isolate the princes, and ask the public to trust the same machinery that created the silence. Do not let them make your fear evidence against you." A chair scraped in the background. Diana lowered her voice. "Anne, if it is you, I am sorry. I know what duty has cost you. But duty is not the same as protecting those who exploit it." The cassette ended with a soft click. No music followed, no commentary, only the sound of the library clock. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then the custodian stepped forward. "That recording cannot be admitted," he hissed, his face rigid. "Its provenance is unverified." "The forensic report is beside it," Anne replied. "The original cassette was found in the hidden compartment. The recording itself does not establish every claim, but it establishes that the warning existed. It establishes nothing about Queen Camilla's accounts. It establishes why those accounts must be independently examined." The custodian's eyes hardened. "You are allowing grief to become a weapon." Anne looked at him with a sorrow more terrible than anger. "No. I am refusing to allow grief to be used as a shield." Another interruption came from the satellite handset. Eleanor touched the console, and a new voice emerged. This time it was Harry. His voice sounded hoarse, as though he had been speaking for hours or crying without permitting himself to be heard. "Anne," he rasped, "I'm in the air. William sent me the documents." "Then you know what they contain." "I know they contain enough to make the palace afraid." A pause. "Is Camilla safe?" The question was unexpected, and it moved through the room like a cold current. Anne answered carefully. "The evidence concerns accounts and administrative structures. It does not prove that every person associated with them understood the full arrangement." Harry swallowed audibly. "Will they blame her?" "They will try to make everyone choose a side before the facts are examined." "And Charles? Your father has been warned." Harry's breathing broke. "He called me last night. He said there was no danger. He said the family had to hold together." "The family can hold together around the truth," Anne whispered, "not around a secret designed to control it." The line went quiet. Then Harry choked out, "Tell William the first I'm coming. He knows. Tell him I'm sorry." Anne's eyes lifted. For what? For believing the wrong people. The transmission ended. Outside, the black vehicles remained on the drive, their engines idling. Police arrived, then security officers, then officials who claimed to be acting in the interests of the estate. Each group brought different instructions. The custodian stood at the center of the confusion, clipboard pressed against his chest. He had spent decades surviving because no one could point to the exact moment he had crossed a line. Now the line was visible. It ran through every concealed account, every redirected inquiry, every record marked not for circulation. Anne instructed Eleanor to send encrypted copies to 3 independent legal teams and 2 parliamentary oversight offices. The transfer began. Green indicators appeared across the console. The palace attempted to interfere. One channel failed, another opened. A third mirrored the packet automatically. "They can no longer erase the originals," Eleanor whispered. Anne nodded. "Then the truth has left the room." The phrase traveled through the broadcast. Across pubs in Edinburgh, pint glasses froze mid-air. In Cardiff, families gathered around televisions that had been turned on for morning news and now displayed the Princess Royal standing beneath an ancestral portrait. In London, crowds formed outside palace gates without knowing whether they were there to defend the crown or demand that it explain itself. Public sentiment divided along familiar lines, but the old certainty had fractured. Some believed the allegations were an elaborate attack. Others believed the palace had finally been caught in a system of financial concealment. Many believed the most unsettling possibility, that the documents were not a complete story, but only the first visible edge of a much larger structure. Anne did not claim to possess the final answer. She claimed the right to ask questions in public. That distinction was the difference between responsible disclosure and sensational accusation. Yet the drama remained impossible to contain. The custodian moved closer to the desk. "You have no authority to release private family material," he murmured, his composure returning in thin layers. "I have authority to protect the institution from a private office that has confused itself with the institution," Anne shot back. "You are not the crown. Neither are you." "No," she replied, voice trembling with restrained fury. "I am the person who has served it without needing to own it." The line silenced him. The rain stopped. A single shaft of pale sunlight crossed the carpet, illuminating dust motes that danced above the Persian rug. The swallow seal glinted crimson beside the black cassette. The object had begun as a symbol of private warning. Now it had become a public emblem of delayed justice. At Windsor, William emerged from the locked corridor carrying no official folder, no palace brief, and no prepared statement. He walked toward a waiting camera and stopped. "I have seen the documents," he stated, his voice strained but controlled. "They must be examined by independent authorities. No member of my family should be asked to defend records they have not been permitted to read." The sentence was brief. It was enough. The palace issued no immediate response. Charles's office remained dark. Camilla's representatives released a statement saying that the Queen had not been given access to the full material, and rejected any suggestion that she had knowingly participated in wrongdoing. The wording was cautious, legal, and visibly defensive. It did not confirm the accounts. It did not explain the reserve. It did not name the men in gray. And because it did none of those things, the silence grew louder. By noon, the financial oversight offices had received the encrypted copies. By afternoon, lawyers representing the Crown, the consort's household, and the independent archive had begun issuing carefully contradictory letters. Every letter used the words alleged, disputed, and subject to review. None could make the swallow disappear. The documents would be examined. The accounts would be traced. The authority of the men who had controlled the records would be questioned. That was the immediate consequence the palace had feared. Not a verdict, but an investigation that could no longer be stopped by ceremony. Charles finally appeared after dusk. He stood alone in a private room at Clarence House, without uniform, without advisors, and without the familiar symbols of sovereign command. The broadcast did not show his face directly. A palace camera captured only his silhouette behind frosted glass as he spoke to Anne through a secure line. "You have broken the family," he whispered, his voice hollow. "No," Anne replied, sitting beside the desk where the cassette had been played. "The secrecy broke it. I have only stopped pretending that the fracture is a bond." Camilla did not create every arrangement. Then let the investigation distinguish what she knew from what she did not know. Charles fell silent. For several seconds, there was only the faint hiss of the line. "I was told the reserve protected us," he finally murmured. "From what? From instability, from claims, from people who wanted to use private wealth against the crown." Anne's eyes closed. "And who protected you from the people who told you that?" The question cut deeper than accusation. Charles breathed in sharply. "The custodian said disclosure would trigger a constitutional crisis. The custodian has been triggering one quietly for decades." Another silence. Then Charles said, "I signed some of the approvals. Were you shown the complete chain?" "No." The word emerged like a confession stripped of ceremony. "Were you told Camilla had access?" Anne asked. "I was told the arrangements were for the stability of the household." "That is not an answer." Charles's voice broke. "I don't know." It was the first honest sentence he had spoken all day. The conversation ended without reconciliation, but it created something more important. A record that the king himself did not possess the complete information surrounding the structures he had been asked to defend. The next morning, the custodian disappeared from public view. His office was sealed. His access credentials were suspended. The official explanation described a temporary administrative leave, but 3 separate sources within the household confirmed that investigators had removed files, computers, and locked boxes from his rooms. No one knew whether he had fled, been protected, or simply moved into another layer of the machinery. The men in gray rarely vanished. They changed corridors. Harry landed in Britain before sunrise. William met him at a private entrance, and for several seconds the brothers stood without speaking. Cameras remained outside the gates, but the moment belonged to them. Harry reached first. William's arms closed around him. The embrace was awkward, exhausted, and real. It lasted longer than protocol would have permitted. Inside the palace, the family's public language began to change. There were no grand denials, no ceremonial declarations of unity. Instead, a statement promised a full independent examination of all relevant financial arrangements and administrative decisions. The word independent appeared 3 times. It was not enough to satisfy the public, but it was the first indication that the machinery had lost complete control. Anne returned to the library at Gatcombe alone. The rain had cleared, leaving the windows washed and bright. The Persian rug still held the faint imprint of the desk. The crimson wax lay broken into 2 pieces. The cassette had been copied, sealed, and delivered to the archive. The original letter rested inside a new protective sleeve, its swallow visible beneath transparent paper. Anne touched the sleeve with one finger. She remembered Diana in the garden, remembered the white flowers, the wet stone, the trembling voice that had asked her to wait until the people hiding the truth believed they had won. The prophecy had not saved Diana. It had not prevented the years of suffering, the isolation, the public betrayal, or the wounds carried by her sons. But it had survived. That mattered. Anne placed the broken wax seal in a small wooden box and closed the lid. The box would be sent to a private memorial archive, not buried in secrecy, but preserved as evidence of the moment a hidden warning entered the public record. "You were right to wait," Anne whispered, her voice trembling, "and I was right to open it." A single tear fell onto the sleeve. She did not hide it. The final broadcast began without announcement. Anne sat before the camera as evening gathered beyond the mullioned windows. She no longer held the papers. They had already traveled beyond the palace, beyond the family, beyond any single person's power to suppress them. The investigation will determine what was lawful, what was misunderstood, and what was deliberately concealed, she said. But there is one truth no investigation can erase. A monarchy cannot demand trust while refusing transparency from those who serve it. A family cannot heal around a wound it is forbidden to name. Her voice softened. Diana once told me that the swallow represented pure truth because it always returned to the place from which it had been driven. I did not understand her then. I understand her now. The camera remained on her face. Behind her, the ancestral portraits seemed less powerful than before. Their painted eyes watched, but they could no longer command silence. For years, Anne continued, the people of this country were asked to believe that loyalty meant looking away. It does not. Loyalty means protecting the institution from those who confuse it with themselves. She paused. In London, the palace gates remained closed. In Windsor, William and Harry stood together beneath a corridor light. In Clarence House, Charles stared at a blank statement he had not yet signed. In a private room, Camilla waited for documents that might finally explain the financial structures built around her name. And in an office whose door had been sealed, the clipboard of the custodian lay face down on a table, its red-marked pages frozen in the exact position investigators had found them. The broadcast began to weaken. The encrypted uplink flickered. A technical warning appeared, then vanished. Anne looked directly into the lens one last time. The truth has not destroyed the crown, she whispered. It has given the crown a chance to survive itself. The signal cut to black. No music followed. No commentary softened the silence. Across Britain, millions of people remained motionless before darkened screens, waiting for someone to tell them what they had just witnessed. No one did. The swallow had finally flown free.